Welcome back to the Triple J podcast show. Next topic, poverty. So I'll summarize this one. Uh, Essentially, we don't pick our students. Some will come in with poverty, and that can be very troubling. It can affect everything from a student's nutrition level to their social well-being to their academic performance. So some of the issues with that is students' well-being, their Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like if their basic needs aren't being met, we can't really expect them to perform at their best. And also, as was highlighted in the case study that we went over as a class, homework can kind of be a real challenge because students may be doing the parents' workload and keeping the house in order if it's a single family household, single parent household rather. So we have to think about those different variables when it comes to poverty for sure. So what are some strategies that we can combat this variable? Julia?
Yeah, Julia, you go.
I think one of the biggest things that I kind of thought of was that we need to avoid, learning materials, text, anything like that have really biased descriptions of, poor or working class people, because that really sets a stereotype onto them and that really influences what other students might perceive. If a student comes wearing the same t-shirt 2 days in a row, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're poor, but kids may take it that way depending on what your language and how you present these topics, or how you present these topics in class. And I think too, this is just something that I know previously in my own schools we've done, is destigmatizing breakfast programs, and be a model for your students. In one of my practicums had a student who was embarrassed to eat his snacks, and because they weren't that healthy because his parents couldn't afford it. And instead of saying, oh, well, that's not very healthy for you, why can't you bring something else? And other students would point out like, oh, that's not a power pack food, that's not good for your body. So instead, every day at snack, I'd say, oh my gosh, you have a corn dog today? That sounds so good. And really modeling that, everyone and what they have is okay. We should all be celebrated, every student. We don't need to pick on anyone. We need to respect each other and support each other, and really having that in your classroom as an expectation.
Yeah, what are your thoughts, Jen?
My thoughts are, I'm going to use the strategies that you've just said, but a child who's living in poverty sometimes doesn't even know that they're living in poverty. Their parents might be super hardworking. Their parents might still read them a bedtime story time they go to bed. Like they'll still have their meal. It's not gonna always be such a negative thing. I've heard stories of kids who find out years later that they're living in poverty and they didn't know that their parents are working 2 to 3 jobs. Like they're like, we just have a normal childhood. So trying to get away from trying to sympathize or have sympathy for people in poverty is going to be huge, because just because you come from a lower socioeconomic status doesn't mean that you're any less than any of the students in the room. If a child's coming in and you notice they have little lunch or they're wearing the same thing, and one day recognize that, take point of that, keep a chart log or something, and when you feel comfortable and you have enough of like hypotheses, just ask them about it. Sometimes they're not going to be honest and you're going to have to understand that, but just keep track of it and really just try, like maybe you bring in snacks for everyone in the classroom. Like, you guys don't have to eat this, but I brought this, I baked this, like I did this, like just, or maybe you get the school to organize like a clothing drive or a shoe drive, just like things that kids don't think that they need, but they do. So like those are the thoughts that just popped in my head as we were talking about this.
Yeah, I think both of you highlight some good things. Julia, with like a breakfast lunch program, like we need to destigmatize that and provide it. And then also, I think a huge thing is to have high expectations of all students, regardless of their background. There are countless examples of people who have, risen up from poverty and become extraordinary successes. So I think we need to, provide those examples of resiliency and teach the students resilience and have high expectations for them and all students, and also make learning relevant and engaging for them at their level. That's a big one for all students. And lastly, like you mentioned, Jen, working with families eventually. You always have your administrator support, and it doesn't take too much digging to find out what students are going through, right? So sometimes it can be hard to find that out, but I think it's a worthy investigation, so we can meet students where they're at, and always asking, like, all behavior is communication, as we've mentioned in other classes. So just understanding where students are at, I think, is crucial.
Just to interject before we move on, I think, like, I love the point about having high expectations for all of our students. But I think for some teachers, we really need to highlight that that doesn't mean we're just sending them off the deep end, like, hey, I have high expectations, good luck. It still means providing supports for that student. And, as the case study that we talked about in class, I think one of the biggest things that the teacher could have done is said, you're here every morning. Why don't I come help you in the morning when no one else is here? That's a time when we can support that student who is uncomfortable about being singled out or, for their economic status. And so I think we really just still need to provide support while still having those high expectations.
Yeah.
100%, couldn't agree more. Great. Next topic, corporate influences. Julia.
Okay, so excuse me while I ramble on about corporate influences. So corporate influences in schools are directly related to how schools are funded. And while public schools are funded by the government and taxes, they also have access to alternative funding through partnerships, sponsorships, fundraising, incentive program, corporate sponsored educational materials, sales of services, and user fees. But through alternative funding or private funding, corporate influences, commercialism, can greatly influence students' perceptions of the world and really train them to become consumers. And there's actually a lack of policies from governments about corporate influences in schools, and often individual school boards have the power to decide what corporations or brands can infiltrate the schools. And this can greatly impact not only how students are influenced, but the resources that are available to students, which ultimately affects their education. And often schools turn to alternative funding due to financial trouble, rising costs of services and materials, increasing public and government expectations. However, when schools rely on public fund or private funding, negative factors can occur, such as inequity between schools due to different community demographics. You might have a school in a community where the families are extremely wealthy, and they're going to be able to do more fundraising. They're going to have access to corporations might want to put more programs in that school because they know they have more money, whereas schools in different lower income that have lower income families might not have as many opportunities and resources available. As well, there's an increase in competition due to that because school programs might only have so much availability from private donors. There's also some corporations that target their funding, which results in the donors having a greater influence over the decisions about what programs are in the school, and they have more influence in the school. And funding might have strings attached. A lot of corporations will say, well, we'll give you this, but we want advertising in return. And there's an instability of funds and a lack of educational quality of control because there's no individual appointed to ensure that the resources provided to the schools are unbiased, complete, and accurate. There's no one in charge of this, so it's not fair. So commercialism in schools also plays a factor as to what brand students are trained to be loyal to. And I'll also talk about this more later, but alternative funding does have benefits. It can provide more programs, more accessibility to resources, and general assistance with providing a good education for students. An issue is how highly influential school is for students. And so if brands or corporations bring in commercialism, students are very likely to be influenced and develop brand loyalty or biases based on what information these corporations are bringing into schools. So with that big chunk, does anyone want to chime in here?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the main strategy we can do for students is teach them to be smart consumers. explicitly teach them that about data mining and how every time they go on a website, they're building their online profile and they're getting targeted ads at them. You know, I think we should try to mitigate that exposure in the schools for sure. And we just need to teach them to be smart consumers and critical thinkers of what they're purchasing, because subliminal messages is a thing. And the sneakiness of these advertisers and their infiltration in the school is alarming. So I think we need to find wholesome ways to do fundraising and think critically about why we are using certain sponsorships, and just think of the implications. Like, are we supporting local or are we supporting big business? Those kind of implications, I think, are critical to this discourse.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, one thing that a strategy that comes to mind is what Kelly Gallagher's book, Right Like This, is the whole chapter on evaluate and judge. Like, that is just teaching kids that when you go on websites, be aware of fake news articles, look at your sources, look at what's cited, just always be cognitive and always think about the things that are around you, including the internet. You can use the evaluate and judge strategies to go past just what you see on the internet, but literally the Coke bottle that's down the way from your classroom. I think one of the biggest things is that we have to, again, like Jason said, be careful of subliminal messaging. If a teacher only comes in with Starbucks, kids are going to notice that. They're like, why don't you drink Tim Hortons? And you're like, oh, I just like Starbucks better. It's already implanting in the kid's mind that, oh, Starbucks might actually be better than Tim Hortons. But I think something we also have to recognize that we might want to get kids to think local, but sometimes those local businesses do not have the funds to advertise or to put stuff into the classrooms. Like in my high school, Sir Winston Churchill in Calgary, we had Cocoa Brooks as part of our cafeteria. But they're really expensive, like their food was just expensive, and now they're no longer there. So now there's no business in the Sir Winston Churchill cafeteria. They couldn't keep up with the demand of a local business. So I think that's also worth pointing out that you can try, and I think the biggest thing is that you can try, but sometimes it's not doable, and sometimes those big corporations really come in and they give you a really good deal, and you're like, how can I not take this? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just thinking about the implications and just asking why and making sure that it is in a responsible manner. So yeah, Julia, your final thoughts on this one?
I think it's like, get students to develop critical thinking skills. That's the biggest thing. It applies to so many other topics as well, but have those discussions. Why are we fundraising this? Why are we doing this certain brand? Why do we bring this into the school? And get them to think about it. Put it into your classroom, put it into your lessons. Don't just slyly mention it, actually have a conversation about it. Because yeah, those critical thinking skills aren't just great for this, it's lifelong skills. So
100%. So on to our final and ninth topic, Indigenous education. Jen, do you want to take hold of this one?
Yeah, so Indigenous education, to summarize that, is just implementing Indigenous ways of knowing into your classroom. Throughout me trying to find ways to summarize this or to make it point blank, I saw that there's an abundance of resources out there that we can use. And I'm shocked that they're not used in schools. So one of the things that I found is that Learn Alberta actually has a curriculum for Blackfoot ways of knowing. It's for grades 10, 20, and 30. And I was like, I don't even remember this being an option in class, like in school. And it just points down that there is a lack of representation and a lack of funding towards Indigenous expertise in the
that was made in like
private.
2006 too. That document was made in like 2006. So it's
Was
alarming.
Was it 2006?
Or maybe it's like 2011. It's within the last 10 years for sure. So it's been around for like a decade. And
Yeah.
I didn't even know about it. Even in our programming as CNI instructors, we've never even like touched that one. So I was shocked about that one as well.
Yeah, so I was like, interesting. And it gets to the point where Indigenous education is sometimes, well, personally, I feel is slapped on to try and show that you're in reconciliation, when in fact that it's just like the video we watched a couple of weeks back where I can't remember the lady, but she was like, reconciliation isn't just putting posters up in your classroom or showing an Indigenous film. It's actually teaching them about the Black history, about colonialism, about residential schools. Like you can't go away from that. And I think by them having a curriculum out there for Blackfoot, for land, like it, and no one's teaching it, is pretty eye-opening, and it's still sad, and it shows that reconciliation, even though it's a positive thing, sometimes isn't working. Like it's just non-refundable, and it kind of upsets that we have to recognize that people are upset. Intergenerational trauma is a thing. Like you need to teach your kids that you can't just teach the sad history. Like back to what we were talking about with race, you have to teach the good stuff. Like talk about Indigenous architects, scientists, inventors. Like if you're talking to kids about all these great things that Westerners or Europeans have done, bring in some type of Indigenous culture into that. And since we are, like I said, on Blackfoot land, there's so many, you can bring in Dan Shay, like there's so many profs like Mary Fox, like get someone from the Red Crow College. Like there's so many things that we can do so that we're not culturally appropriating a culture, but instead we're acculturating it. We just have to be cognizant of the Indigenous cultures in your area. Like, yeah, we're in Calgary and Lethbridge and Blackfoot is all around us, but you move into Saskatchewan, you have the Cree. You move into Ontario, you have Ojibways. Like every Indigenous culture is different in the way that they do propose education, and we just have to be aware of how we're going to integrate it into the classroom and do it in an authentic way, opposed to slapping it on just to try and reach a criteria.
Exactly. I don't think you want to tokenize Indigenous education. You don't want to just check off the TQS5. I think it's about integrating foundational understandings, and that document you mentioned is a good one. And we need to indigenize the curriculum. And in our field, in ELA, we have a lot of freedom to do so. And it's bringing in those positive representations and lots of it. And again, tying back to other themes that we've talked about in this podcast is embracing the resiliency factors, embracing the celebration of how much this group of people have been through and where they are now, and also consulting and collaborating with those stakeholders that you mentioned, those professors, those elders, the Blackfoot people themselves. Because as I was raised in class, like, are we doing this? Like who's benefiting from us bringing in Indigenous foundational knowledge, right? Is it all students? Is it the Indigenous student, or is it the predominantly white students? It can be tricky, but I think how you combat that is just consultation and collaboration with those stakeholders.
Absolutely. I think that's really important to acknowledge that, you know, I'm a white individual. I don't know a lot. I know more than some people because of my family, but I don't know everything. And it's so important to discuss and collaborate with others, elders and other Indigenous people, because, we can't speak for them. We can't speak for their culture, for their traditions. Just something that I came across in one of my practicums was that the Calgary Public Library actually has a video doing the land acknowledgement. And I didn't know that until my TA brought it to my attention. And I just think that was so great, because even I didn't know about it. And I ended up I used that, and I used like traditional
I did
oral
too.
storytelling. Yeah, like it's really great to bring that into the
The
classroom.
kids love it.
They do, yeah. And it's
Yes.
interesting, like I worked with kindergarten, so they don't understand the severity of all the history, and they can't. They're in kindergarten. They're not going to be able to fully understand it yet. But being able to introduce who Indigenous people are, introduce those Indigenous ways of knowing. And, it just enhances their learning as well. So, you might be doing some of these strategies for Indigenous students, but it is important for everyone, and everyone can benefit from them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that comes to the end of our podcast show.
I think
Jen,
it's good to point out.
Yeah, go ahead, Julia, or Jen, sorry.
I was just gonna say, like, yeah, it's it's good to point that out. Like, I had no Indigenous students in my first practicum, but talking about indigeneity was amazing, and they were so catching it, and they were outraged when we were learning about treaties. They're like, why would they make Indigenous people sign this? Like, what? Why did they do that? And like, how come they're getting this sliver of land? Like, they were outraged, and I was like, those are the reactions that we want to see. Like, it's not all just like rainbows and flowers, like things were bad. So Indigenous education is enlightening for like all of us. So
100%. Any final thoughts on this contextual variables discussion there, Jen or Julia?
I feel like we've summed it as best
Yeah,
we
I
can.
think we covered a lot.
Yeah.
And to tie this back to our first lecture, if education is to be the great equalizer, then we have to combat these variables. And I hope that we've done a good job of highlighting the issues and discussing what we can do about it. So thank you for taking in this episode of the Triple J podcast. Can't wait to see you next time. Take care.